I was 20 years old, and that year I decided to move to the huge city of California. I came from a quiet little town, so I felt a bit out of place seeing all those people everywhere, and to be honest, it was a bit overwhelming. But luckily, I rented a room with a really cool guy named Lester, and he helped me adjust and make some friends. Lester and I had almost nothing in common. He came from a super rich family while I had grown up on a farm, but he always invited me to go out with him and his friends to fancy parties. Although I must say that I always felt a bit uncomfortable, it was as if it was noticeable that I didn't belong in that world. When New Year's Eve came around, he told me he was organizing a party in an incredible skyscraper. I was quite surprised, but the truth is that it wasn't the kind of event I enjoyed. So I told him I had other plans when I was really alone in my room, watching a Friends marathon in my pajamas. Around 10 at night, suddenly, the loneliness hit me like a bucket of cold water. I thought, I hadn't moved so far away just to stay locked in my room on New Year's Eve, a night when everyone else is celebrating. So I decided to send Lace a message to see if I could still go to the party, and he replied with a video of him surrounded by a lot of beautiful people. But I couldn't hear anything because the music was blaring and his expression said he wanted me to join them. He had already sent me the address, so I dressed quickly, as best I could, and ran out. When I arrived, I had to go through the security guard at the entrance, who already knew I was going to a party. Then I took the elevator, and suddenly I heard a loud noise outside, but I didn't realize what it was, and I didn't think anything of it. When I got to the 15th floor and looked for apartment C, I noticed that the door was open, but I didn't hear any music or laughter, so I peeked inside. The place was empty. There were only party leftovers. Empty glasses and plates of snacks, but no one was there, which left me very puzzled and confused. "Hello?" I shouted, but there was only silence. I decided to go in, and at that moment I noticed that the balcony door was open, letting in an icy wind, but no one was outside, and I started to feel weird, as if I had been set up or something. Leicester must be playing a joke on me, was the first thing I thought. He sent me to this place to laugh at me with his friends, I said to myself, and a torrent of anger washed over me as I returned to the elevator. Just as I entered, a short, wrinkled old man was already inside. He smiled at me as he got off and asked me something that I don't remember because I didn't even hear it. I was so caught up in my anger at the time that I just nodded in response. I didn't feel like talking anymore. However, he insisted, "It looks like your friends left the party. Do you know where they went?" "No," I said, and all he could manage to mumble was, "I'm going downstairs." The discomfort grew as I stood next to him. Without thinking, I pressed the button for the next floor and decided I was going to take the stairs. "Is this your stop?" asked the old man. But I didn't answer. I just ignored him and shot out of the elevator. Luckily, he didn't follow me, so I went down the stairs, and when I reached the next floor, I started to hear police sirens. The tension was palpable. Many voices could be heard, conversations and murmurs, and that intrigued me. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw a small window to look out of, so I leaned out to see what was happening outside, and when I did, I was stunned. Police lights were flashing all along the street, and there were a lot of people gathered in the parking lot just below. People were congregating around something, and I immediately had a bad feeling. With my heart starting to beat fast, I approached to get a better look at what was happening. At first, I saw what appeared to be a pile of clothes lying on the ground, so I quickly went down to the next floor and looked again. And to my horror, it wasn't clothes. It was a pile of bodies scattered in impossible positions, and some were on top of others. There were a lot of them, and there was a lot of blood. The scene was terrifying. But the worst came when I entered them. I recognized Leicester. I was petrified, but soon everything fell into place. The people at the party had fallen from the balcony. I cannot describe in words how I felt at that moment. It was a mixture of panic, pain, and even guilt. I felt like throwing up and fainting. I had never seen anything so horrible in my life, and seeing my friend, with whom I had spoken less than half an hour before, lying dead on the pavement caused me to feel a deep pain in my chest. I found myself being carried away by the confusion and fear as I continued down to the ground floor. I needed to know what was going on, what had caused all this tragedy, and it didn't take me long to find out. When I reached the lobby, I saw two policemen restraining someone on the floor, a man who was struggling and trying to break free, but as I approached, I froze. I realized it was the man from the elevator. Suddenly, one of the policemen approached his face and shouted, "Why did you do this?" The man said nothing, but in an instant he slowly raised his head and looked me straight in the eye. Then he whispered, "The party was too noisy." I was frozen. The policeman took him away in handcuffs, but he continued to stare at me. After they left, I left the building feeling completely dazed. I remember the security guard trying to say something to me, but I was too shocked to listen. I went out into the cold night trying to process what I had just seen. Lester was dead, and so were so many other innocent people just because their party was too loud for a crazy neighbor. That made me think that night I escaped death. Not once, but twice. I didn't even want to think about what would have happened to me if I had arrived at the party earlier, or if I had stayed in the elevator with that madman instead of going out and down the stairs. I probably would have been dead too. Later, I learned from the news that this man entered the party armed, subdued all the guests and forced them one by one to jump off the balcony, and those who resisted were killed right there. Let me start with the truth. In my mid-20s, I was a total mess. I was a single guy who did what he wanted, and when I look back on those days, I can only feel ashamed because the truth is that I did a lot of damage, and honestly, I was a real idiot. Sometimes life taught me a good lesson, like when the police arrested me or when I was knocked out thanks to my super-inflated ego, stupidly so, it must be said. But one night at the end of October, I faced the hardest lesson of all, and that is what I have come to tell you today. I have always hated Halloween. As a child, I would go out trick-or-treating with my friends without a costume, and I would curse those who didn't give me anything because I wasn't dressed up in something ridiculous, and as you can imagine, that hatred carried over into my adult years. I would go out with girls who wanted to dress up, and I simply refused. I even avoided parties at that time. But one year, everything changed. Not because I suddenly started to love Halloween, but because I met a girl called Brianna. I met her by chance on a Tuesday night in a bar. We were chatting, and of course her passion for Halloween came to light, but she soon realized how much I hated it, and instead of being scared, she said to me in a seductive tone, "I think you need to reconsider your position." I laughed and told her, "Not on your life." It was then that she pointed to the corner of the bar, where there were 3 more girls, all gorgeous and also my type. Brianna greeted them and they returned the gesture. At that moment, my mind was racing, trying to understand what she wanted to tell me with that gesture. But then she dropped the bomb on me. "Those are my friends, and we're going to a Halloween party in the woods. None of us have dates, so if you're up for it, you could be our date tonight," she said sensually and winked at me. To be honest, I had no idea how to react. I just smiled and laughed ironically as she started to caress me under the table, sending me all those positive vibes, you know? Without going into more detail, let's just say that Brianna managed to convince me to go to that Halloween party, promising me lots of fun for that night with her friends. The kind of person I was back then, I would never have said no to an invitation like that. So that's how I left the bar that night, surrounded by these 3 incredible women and with my ego through the roof. And I didn't even stop to think about how many red flags were waving in the air. First of all, who has a Halloween party on a Tuesday night in a forest and without warning? It might be possible, but it wasn't common. And then, what woman in her right mind would trust a stranger from a bar to accompany them to the forest? They didn't know anything about me, but I, in my infinite ignorance, only saw the opportunity to spend an incredible night with 4 beautiful girls. So I got into my car with Brianna and one of her friends, while the other 2 drove in separate cars. They told me to follow them because Bree knew the way to the party, and so I did. I must say that this was before GPS became commonplace, so that was my version of one that night. We drove for a while, and soon I began to question my choice to have gone. Doubts were beginning to creep in. As we made our way along the unlit road, The only thing that illuminated me was the moon, and the excitement I felt at being surrounded by those girls. But did I really know where we were going? Obviously not. The atmosphere became strange as we went deeper into the forest, and there I was, ignoring the warning signs, sure that I would end up having a great night. But at this point, I couldn't help wondering if I had made a big mistake. Brianna was cunning and she knew what she was doing. Every time doubt crossed my mind, it was as if she could read my thoughts. Then, out of the blue, she would kiss me on the neck or say something daring that made the doubts completely vanish. Finally, the car in front stopped at the side of the road and I followed it, but there was no light anywhere. Then two girls took out flashlights and signaled for me to follow them, and there I could see a small path almost hidden in the undergrowth by the side of the road. The three friends were ahead with the flashlights, while Bree and I followed them, and as I walked, I was trying to listen for any noise, music, or laughter, but all I heard was the deep silence of the forest, and that gave me a bad feeling. Suddenly, the girls started running, and Brianna stopped me. I tried to ask what was going on, but then she put her finger to my lips, silencing me. She looked at me seductively and started walking, gently pushing me, making me walk backwards. At that moment, I was just going with the flow. I thought it was some kind of erotic game and that later the other girls would appear in sexy lingerie or something like that. Don't judge me, I was drunk and completely turned on by the whole situation. She guided me towards a tree behind us, and honestly, it was so dark I could barely see her face. But there was enough moonlight to make out her features and her piercing gaze. Just as I felt the tree behind me, Brianna looked at me intensely, whispered "It's time" in my ear, and came closer as if to give me a kiss, so I closed my eyes and leaned in for that kiss. But instead, I got a good blow to the head. Instinctively, I covered myself because the pain was intense, but it was then that I received a second blow, this time with the back of what looked like a flashlight. At that moment, I fell to my knees, dazed. I had no idea she was carrying a heavy bag, but when she guided me to the tree, she took it out silently, and honestly, I didn't even notice until she slammed it on my head. I don't know what was inside that thing, but it was a very painful blow and it practically knocked me out. As I lay on the ground, almost in the fetal position, I heard footsteps approaching quickly. I looked up and saw the other girls approaching me, but instead of helping me, they started kicking me and hitting me with their flashlights. Before long, I found myself completely curled up in a ball, trying to endure the beating while moaning and screaming in pain. These women took my wallet and cell phone, as well as my watch and a couple of rings I was wearing. My phone was an old and completely useless phone, but if I had had it, I could have at least called the police. After kicking me a few more times and taking anything of value they could find, the women fled, running back along the road they had come from. A few moments later, I heard the car's engine starting up and driving away, while I remained lying on the ground in a state of shock. Finally, after about 10 or 15 minutes, I managed to get to my feet and walk to my car. I felt like I had been run over by a truck, but fortunately they didn't take my car. They probably couldn't find my keys. However, they did smash the windscreen and the passenger door. With great difficulty, I managed to drive until I found a 24-hour petrol station, and there, the lady who worked there helped me to call the police. I ended up providing the names and descriptions of the girls, but it was going to be obvious that they wouldn't find them. Logically, those weren't their real names, and I also didn't realize what kind of car I was following. I had no idea what model it was, and if it was black, dark gray, or even navy blue. It wasn't long after that night that I really started to make changes in my life. I was lucky to get away with just a few broken ribs, but sometimes it gives me chills to think about those girls, what they might be doing now, and how many more they must have done to like they did to me. And here I am, in my late 30s, and still hating the Halloween season. After finishing university, I went through a period when I felt lost, like a ship without a compass, with no idea what I wanted to do with my life, so, like many, I ended up surrounded by friends who were just as confused as I was. Our nights would turn into crazy parties, drinking until we fell over, while during the day we slept like there was no tomorrow. My drinking buddy back then was Damien, I met him in our first year because we happened to share a room, and luckily we got on very well. So when I decided to move out and get my own place, Damien joined the adventure. It wasn't long before he became the life of the party, putting away more drinks than any guy we knew. Every weekend, the other guys would come to our table, only to end up surrendering to Damien. I secretly admired him for his ability to drink, but at the same time I was worried that this lifestyle would lead him to a darker place, and I had every reason to think so. When we graduated, we were in the same situation with our degrees in hand, but with mediocre jobs and many doubts about the future, as it turned out that not many companies are interested in hiring recent graduates, so we had to settle for what we could. A year passed and neither Damien nor I managed to get anything in our areas, and while we dealt with our shifts during the week, we made the weekends a festival of excess. Nothing had changed. He continued to drink without control, and I tried to survive another night of madness while we struggled to make ends meet with miserable salaries that we almost always left in the bars. Over time, my joy began to fade more and more. Alcohol became too important a part of my life, and I was so caught up in my own problems that I didn't notice how quickly Damien was self-destructing. It was clear that we both had a serious drinking problem, but in his case, things were much more complicated. We used to enjoy knocking back those bad guys who thought they were tough because they could drink, but since we finished university, real life hit us hard. Drinking became the only thing that really made him happy, so it wasn't just a weekend thing anymore. He would get up every morning and have breakfast with a beer because, according to him, it was the way to start the day with energy. At first, I found it funny, but soon I started to get really worried. Every time I mentioned it to him, Damien just laughed and said I was exaggerating, joking about how alcohol was his engine and holding his drinks his best talent. One weekend, a work colleague organized a birthday party, and of course there we were. That night, the years of excess began to take their toll on Damien. Shortly after arriving, he found a new challenger, and they started doing drinking competitions like there was no tomorrow. However, after a while, I began to notice that my friend was acting strangely. I had never seen him like this before. Not only was he very drunk, but his skin was starting to turn yellow and he was drenched in sweat. I was worried about him and asked him if he was okay, but he replied with an "everything's fine" that was faker than a $3 bill. About an hour and a half passed, and I was distracted by a charming girl I met at the party and with whom I went for a walk. When I returned, I was shocked to see that Damien was still drinking non-stop, this time attacking the tequila, and I couldn't believe he was still standing. But suddenly, to everyone's astonishment, Damien collapsed to the floor. While he challenged himself to take another drink, he suddenly fell to the ground with a thud that left everyone in a state of shock. The others began to laugh and applaud the winner of the challenge. But I knew that this wasn't just another drunk. He was really in a bad way. So I ran over to him and tried to wake him up, but he didn't respond at all, and I started to panic. I convinced one of my colleagues to help me lift him and take him to my car. On the way, we tried to wake him up countless times, but he didn't respond, and even worse, I noticed that his skin was turning pale and he was having trouble breathing. I was terrified. I drove at full speed to the hospital, feeling my heart jump out of my chest. Of course, I went with him and stayed in the emergency room, watching the doctors work their magic while my head kept bombarding me with disturbing thoughts. Around 1 a.m, my worst nightmare came true. Damien needed a new liver. He had completely destroyed his after years of excess, and the doctor told me that in his entire career, he had seen very few boys our age with such severe damage. That news hit me like a bucket of cold water. I never thought my friend would be so badly off, and I felt overwhelmed with panic at the thought of losing him. When I was finally able to go in to see him, he acted as if nothing was wrong, and I spent almost an hour trying to make him understand the seriousness of his situation, but he had his back to me, ignoring everything I said. Damien was in complete denial. However, the doctor warned me that if he didn't change his lifestyle, he would be dead in a couple of years, and that made me feel like I had been kicked in the stomach. Damien was more than a friend. He was like a brother to me, and just the thought of losing him terrified me. but he didn't seem to care about his own life. As soon as he was discharged, he went back to his routine, as if nothing had happened. I did everything I could to help him understand that his lifestyle was unsustainable. I even decided to stop drinking too, but it was no use. However, seeing how Damien was slowly destroying himself at the same time forced me to reflect on my own life. So I joined a gym and started exercising and eating better. I even lost 40 pounds along the way. I felt great, and I kept telling Damien that he should change too, but he continued with his everything is fine attitude, as if he didn't understand the seriousness of his situation, and that frustrated me a lot. I felt so powerless. However, I felt that I couldn't stand by and do nothing while he self-destructed, so I made the difficult decision to move out. He didn't take the news well, and from then on our friendship became distant. We hardly spoke, and our communication decreased a lot. It was obvious that we no longer had anything in common. I had decided to change and leave all those harmful habits behind, while he was still in that spiral that could only end in disaster. I will never forget that dark day when I saw him, motionless in the coffin. His body had deteriorated to the point of being almost unrecognizable, and it broke my heart. I cried a lot, not only for having lost a friend, but also because I knew it was a death foretold and that he never wanted to fight for his life. Even though I knew that I did everything possible to rescue him from that self-destructive life, I couldn't help feeling guilty. I wish I could have convinced him to join me in this battle. From then on, my life took a radical turn. The more optimistic I became, the more motivation I found to improve other areas of my life. Without those days spent recovering from hangovers, I had time and energy to help others and to dedicate myself to my health and well-being. I started volunteering with special needs students at the local secondary school, and the headmaster, upon realizing my work, encouraged me to go back to school to get my credentials and join the team full-time. Since then, I have been a teacher for almost 7 years, and I like it more and more every day. A while ago, a student asked me about my life before becoming a teacher, and I felt a little uncomfortable telling him how much I had wasted, but I wanted him to understand the importance of living healthily. So I shared my story with him and told him that when we are young, it seems like we have all the time in the world to waste, but I discovered that the more free time I had, the more problems I found. Perhaps it wasn't the answer I was expecting, but it was an important lesson worth learning. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. Susan, my sister, had organized a New Year's Eve party at her new house. After months of preparation, it was our first celebration together since her divorce, and despite everything that had happened, I was feeling optimistic. I remember the house was full of friends, family, and neighbors. My sister and I were sitting at the table with her 6-year-old daughter, Hannah, enjoying the good atmosphere and the company of the important people in her life. Everything was going great until Hannah, in her excited little voice, interrupted. "Mommy, Santa Claus is outside." I laughed as I stroked her hair. "Ha, Santa Claus? He came a week ago, remember? He left a bunch of presents," Susan said to her. But she insisted, "No, dude, he's outside now." Hannah had never been so insistent, so in the end I decided to follow her and see what happened. I put on a coat and followed her as she talked about how she had seen Santa Claus. We went out into the yard, and sure enough, I saw a big guy in a red suit near a nearby garbage bin, taking out a big bag of garbage. But there was nothing to tell me that it was Santa Claus, and even less that he had come to our party. "Honey, that's not Santa Claus, it's just a random man in a costume. Let's go inside." But she was adamant. "No, man, it's him. He had a long beard and a bag of presents." I decided to call it a day and suggested we go back inside. But just then his shoelaces came undone, and he asked me to tie them up again, so I bent down and did it. Then I took one last look towards the bin, but the man was no longer there. I assumed he had left, so I took Hannah's hand and walked towards the house. But just as we were about to go in, a heart-rending scream rang out inside the house. The calm was immediately broken, and screams began to echo all over the place. "What's going on?" Hannah asked, but I was wondering the same thing. The screams went on, and I knew then that something very bad was happening inside the house. So I told Hannah to run to the neighbor's house, Mrs. Rogers, whom we trusted, and told her to stay there until further notice. Go and don't come back until I come looking for you, understand? She nodded, albeit with fear, and ran off. I too rushed towards the house, and as I crossed the patio, the heat inside the house hit me. Something wasn't right, and I quickly found the empty dining room, with plates and glasses all mixed up. As I entered the main hallway, I heard hurried footsteps, and that's when I saw Matt, a friend of Susan's, running towards me crying. "It's killing us," he shouted, and that made my blood run cold. I wanted to ask him what was going on, but before I could get closer, a flash of fire filled the corridor, while the screams intensified. I was petrified to see Matt fall to the ground in front of me, completely on fire. I looked up, and behind him, a guy with a flamethrower appeared from the shadows. I couldn't believe my eyes. The man was wearing a burnt red suit and carrying a flamethrower, a weapon I never thought I'd see up close. His partially burnt mask revealed a scarred face, and my heart stopped as I realized it was the same man I'd seen near the dumpster. There was no time for questions. The man raised the flamethrower and aimed it at me, firing a burst of fire that lit up the corridor. Luckily, I reacted in time. I threw myself to the ground and rolled to one side, feeling the heat of the fire brush against my arm as if my skin were melting. In desperation, I ran to the dining room but realized it was a dead end. I searched frantically for something to defend myself with, but I heard footsteps approaching, and I hid behind the door of the cupboard where the coats were, trying not to make any noise. From outside, I heard another scream, someone pleading for their life, and a few seconds later, the roar of the flamethrower resonated again in the house. The smell of burning flesh began to mix with the smoke that invaded every corner of the place that I knew and loved. For a second, I thought about that and about my sister, and my heart sank. Was she alive? Or had she become another victim of this madman? There was no time to think. I had to get out of there before everything got even worse. The house was on fire and every second counted, so I found a heavy candlestick on one of the nearby tables and grabbed it tightly, thinking I could use it to defend myself if the occasion arose. It was unlikely to be of any use against a flamethrower, but it was better than nothing. The footsteps stopped right in front of the dining room. The guy was looking for someone, probably me, so I crouched down behind the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. Then I saw his shadow as he entered the next room, and I seized the moment. I shot out like a madman and lunged at him. I hit him on the side of the head and managed to knock him down. But as he fell, I saw his face. I froze. That man was Bruce, my sister Susan's ex-husband and Hannah's father. That bastard had threatened Susan when she decided to leave him, and now he was making good on his threat. He saw me too, but said nothing, and then he pushed me so hard that I fell backwards. Then he took a knife from his belt and lunged at me. I raised my arm to protect myself, but the blade cut deep and the pain was unbearable. But I rolled to one side and used the candlestick to try to hit him again. This time he managed to avoid me and got up quickly, grabbing his flamethrower. The metallic sound as he prepared it to fire at me caused me to panic terribly, so I ran again, but this time towards the main entrance. The heat was overwhelming and I could feel the flames devouring the walls. Breathing became a challenge and my legs were shaking like jelly, but I told myself that to stop would mean certain death. So I ran towards the hallway, but before reaching the door, a terrible burning sensation ran down my back. I looked back and saw my clothes on fire. Bruce had fired just before I could escape. I fell to the ground on the grass and rolled around desperately trying to put out the fire. I screamed so loudly I felt as if my throat would tear, and from inside the house, the creaking and cracking of the beams made my heart stop. As soon as I got up, I saw Bruce standing in front of one of the windows watching me. The silence of the night was broken by the sound of distant sirens. The police and fire brigade arrived just as Bruce disappeared from view. A minute later, I heard a shot from inside. Had he killed someone else? No, there was almost no one left alive inside. As I tried to process what was happening, the flames continued to grow, consuming everything in their path, and when the firemen arrived, I collapsed on the floor, exhausted and in pain. The paramedics surrounded me, covering me with blankets while the firemen fought the fire. Then I thought of Susan and the other guests, wondering if anyone else had survived. It took the firemen almost an hour to bring the fire under control, and when they finally entered, they found Bruce dead on the living room floor. His body was charred, and the position of the gun confirmed that he had taken his own life while trying to put out the flames. As they removed the bodies, they found Susan in the kitchen with two of her friends, and other bodies were scattered in the hallway and the dining room. Of the 25 guests, only a few managed to escape, myself included. The police investigated what had happened and discovered that Bruce had been planning this for weeks. He had bought the flamethrower in pieces and had assembled it in secret, leaving messages that distilled hatred towards Susan, blaming her for all his problems. In the midst of all the chaos and the suffering from the loss of many of my loved ones, my sister mainly, the only thing that gave me comfort was knowing that Hannah was safe at the neighbors'. She didn't see anything that happened, and luckily she was the only one who came out completely unharmed, both physically and psychologically. Every New Year's Eve, the memory of that night comes back to haunt me. The smell of smoke, the heat of the fire, the screams. These are things I will never forget. That New Year's Eve, we lived through a horror movie, and one of the cruelest, by the way. A few months later, I told Hannah that Santa Claus didn't exist. I know it was too soon, but I couldn't bear the idea of seeing anyone dressed as Santa again. Just thinking about it still makes me shiver and cry at night. Since then, she has been under my care. She is now a young woman, and I do my best to ensure that that fateful night does not become a cross for her, as it is for me. I'm going to start by saying that I really can't stand parties. For most people, going out with friends and having a good time is great, but for me it's more stressful than fun. I'm married now, and thank goodness my wife also prefers to avoid those crazy events. When I was younger, I used to go out to parties almost every weekend, and the truth is that I did it more to fit in and because of the pressure from my friends than because I really liked it. I'm one of those people who don't get along with the nightlife. I don't even dream of staying up all night or drinking alcohol. I remember that in my last year of high school, my friends convinced me to go to a party at a friend's house called Ben. That day I made up 1,000 excuses, but the truth is that he almost begged me to go, as it would be a kind of farewell for the group. All week everyone was talking about that party, making plans and counting the days until Saturday arrived. They said that things got really crazy at those gatherings, and while everyone was excited, I only felt more anxious. But I had already said that I was going, so I couldn't back out. Finally, Saturday arrived and I went to their house early, looking for a little corner where I could stay a little out of the way of the chaos. Although I was tense at first, little by little they started inviting me to have a couple of drinks. Honestly, I'm not much of a drinker, but since it was our last big party, I decided to try to join in. I made an effort to enjoy myself, and surprisingly, I began to relax a little and had a better time than I expected. I laughed and mixed with my friends, which was something I hadn't expected. The party started early, around 7 p.m., and by midnight it was winding down. To my surprise, I began to think that maybe going out partying with my friends wasn't so bad. I didn't want to leave straight away for 2 reasons. First, I had already had a few drinks and was in no condition to drive, so I decided to stay and help Ben tidy up his house because he lived alone with his mom, who would be back in the morning after a trip, and he didn't want her to find the whole mess. You know how mothers are about cleaning and tidiness. I wasn't the only one who stayed. Some others joined in to help while others planned to stay the night. After a while, the house was more presentable and I felt ready to return to my place. But before leaving, I went to the bathroom, and while I was at it, I heard loud shouting. I heard Ben shout, "You can't show up here anymore, this isn't your house." That phrase was followed by another deep and very aggressive male voice, which replied, "Shut up. I come when I want because this is my home too." I went to the bathroom door to listen better, but suddenly everything got out of control. Screams, cries, and Ben begging, "Please put down the gun." In that instant, my heart rose to my throat. Was there an armed man in the house? Suddenly, I heard a series of blows, more screams, and a deafening noise. The man's voice sounded completely out of control, and I had no idea if he was attacking everyone or just Ben. For a second, I considered leaving the bathroom, but panic set in and I really went into shock. The banging continued, the screams kept getting louder, and the atmosphere was a real mess. I tried to call the police, but I didn't have my phone. I remembered that I had left it in the kitchen while I was helping to clean up. When I realized I didn't have my phone, panic set in from head to toe. Now I was trapped in the bathroom with no way of getting help, while all the chaos was happening outside. Ben's mother's ex had arrived with a gun and was clearly out of his mind. I didn't know if it was more dangerous to get out of there or to stay locked in, but the idea of opening the door and risking a bullet was terrifying. The screams of that man who seemed to be out of control did not stop. At one point, I heard him say that he was going to kill everyone, and then 2 shots rang out in the house. Terror gripped me instantly. However, I knew that no one had been hurt because I had not heard any screams of pain, only panic. No one was saying things like, "He's dead" or "We need help." Just screams and confusion. Then I heard the man promise that the bullet's next destination would be Ben if they didn't shut up. I was living a complete nightmare, and the worst part was that I felt powerless. I knew there was nothing I could do, but the idea of staying here like a coward while my friends were in danger tormented me. Suddenly, the sound of breaking glass reached my ears, followed by shoving, shouting, and Ben's voice calling for them to escape. Then, a ray of light among the shadows, I heard, "Come back here or I promise I'll shoot you." But it didn't last long, because then the echo of 3 shots made my stomach shrink. My heart stopped when I noticed that the madman was running after my friends, and just when I thought that nothing could get any worse, I heard him coming back and walking towards the bathroom where I was. First, he tried to open the door, turning the handle, and then, when he saw that it was closed, he started kicking it. "Who's there?" he shouted. Fear left me paralyzed. That man was determined to get in and do whatever it took. The noise of the blows was terrifying. Blows with his fists and something else, an object that I had no doubt was his weapon. At that moment, I panicked completely and decided that the best thing to do was to lie face down on the floor, covering my ears and praying for him to stop. Meanwhile, the guy kept pounding on the door with furious force. It seemed to last forever. Those minutes seemed like hours, and I couldn't stop thinking that at any moment he was going to break down the door. I couldn't hear anything from my friends, which led me to think that maybe they had managed to get out. Meanwhile, the man was getting more and more out of control, kicking and pushing the door, which thank God was very sturdy. But suddenly, I heard a sound that almost made me cry. Sirens. The police were coming. I didn't know if they were coming for us, but I began to sincerely thank God. However, it seemed that the guy couldn't hear anything that was going on, because he didn't stop banging on the door for a second. Suddenly, I heard the front door open with a bang, and the authority figure shouted, "Stop! Drop the gun and put your hands in the air." Then I heard footsteps running towards the bathroom. I heard a loud thud, and I imagined that he had been knocked down while he continued to shout threats. It was at that moment that I finally found the courage to open the door, and when I did, I came face to face with a police officer, who looked at me with concern and began to ask if I was all right. Well, of course I wasn't all right. I was terrified, but at least that was a relief after having believed that I could die at the hands of an armed psychopath. While the policeman helped me out, a group entered the house and quickly brought the situation under control. They told me to wait in a safe place, and although I was still shaking, I felt an immense amount of relief knowing that I was safe. That night, everything changed. I would no longer be afraid of parties, but of what might happen at them, and maybe of not leaving my phone wherever I went. I left the house with the officer, and that was when I saw that guy for the first time. He was handcuffed, being led towards the patrol car, and in an instant, he looked at me. Guys, I had never seen eyes as terrifying as that guy's. His gaze was completely out of control, his eyes bloodshot, and almost as if they were about to pop out of his head. His hair was tousled, and he was wearing a dark military camouflage outfit with combat boots. He looked like he'd come straight off a battlefield, but what really chilled me was seeing that his hands were stained with blood. For a moment, panic took hold of me. I thought that blood might be from one of my friends, which made me look around worriedly. That's when I saw Ben and 5 other friends approaching. They hugged me and started asking me if I was okay, if that guy had done something to me. I told them no, but I also asked about them, and I was relieved to hear that they were all safe. Although the madman had fired in their direction, fortunately, all the shots missed. This relief was a great weight off my mind. However, one big question remained unanswered. Who was that man? And why did he do what he did? The answer left me completely surprised. It turns out that he was Ben's mom's ex-husband. In other words, his former stepfather. Ben explained to us that this man suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder. He told us that in the past he had had some outbreaks, but nothing like what happened that night. A few months ago, someone close to them had told them that he was going through serious problems, that he had started using drugs, and to make matters worse, he had stopped taking his medication. Despite everything, he and his mother never thought he could be a threat, especially since they had not been in contact since his mother separated from him more than 4 years ago. The truth is that if I didn't enjoy parties before, after this episode, I was convinced that I should avoid them altogether. The idea that someone like that could burst into anyone's life like that was something I wanted to keep far away from me. This experience only made it clear to me that sometimes things can get out of control in the blink of an eye, and I don't feel like risking living through such a nightmare again. I remember the day everything went wrong as if it were yesterday. It was New Year's Eve, and I was in my room, as usual, trapped in front of my computer after having been partying with my friends. They had all gone to celebrate with their families, so I was alone, enjoying the calm while my mother and brother were downstairs, preparing everything for our little New Year's Eve party, something I didn't like at all. But that peace I had was suddenly shattered when my door flew open. It was Brandon, my brother. His face was red and his breathing was coming in and out, as if he had just run a marathon. He was crying, but not in a normal way. He was visibly upset, almost on the verge of collapse. "Mom yelled at me again," he exclaimed as he took off his headphones. I knew him well, and I knew he had always been sensitive, but at that moment he was out of control, so I asked him what was wrong, imagining that it might be related to Mom and her way of being. It turns out that he refused to take a shower because he had already done so in the morning, and for Mom that was completely unacceptable. "Why don't you do what she asks you to do just for today?" I asked him. "Because he has no right. She always treats me like scum," he said, talking a mile a minute, full of anger. His words were full of rage, and I could see something dark in his eyes. This was not the Brandon I knew. He seemed to have completely lost control, and you could see the anger building up inside him. "One day, I'm going to do something to him he won't forget," he swore menacingly. I tried to calm him down, but I had never seen him so furious. I decided it was best to go and talk to Mom before this got out of hand. I found her in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches to dinner, and I told her what was going on. "Mom, Brandon is very upset," I said. She barely looked up and replied, "Now he wants to make trouble for me. That boy needs to learn that he's not always going to get his way." "Mom, I think he needs help, I really do," I insisted. But it was like talking to a wall. She wasn't willing to listen. She only became more defensive. She had always been strict, but with Brandon, it was worse, and every little mistake turned into a lecture or a punishment, and no matter how hard she tried to explain, it seemed to only make her angrier. "I'll be softer with him tonight, but don't push me," she said, and I didn't know if it was a promise or a warning. I returned to my room feeling powerless, praying that the night would end without any problems. How deluded was I? When the guests arrived, Brandon was on the sofa, watching TV as if nothing was wrong. Mom was giving him orders as usual, and although he obeyed her, There was something strange about his behavior, as if he were accumulating energy for a later outburst. I thought that maybe he was just trying to avoid trouble, but there was something disturbing in his gaze, and I could tell. I didn't like this at all, and I just hoped they weren't going to make a spectacle of themselves in front of the guests. Not knowing what to do would be the least of my worries later on. During dinner, everything seemed normal at first. The family chatted, the children laughed, and even Mom smiled a couple of times. But then when Mom noticed how Brandon was eating, his expression suddenly changed. He had sauce stains on his shirt, and that irritated Mom a lot. "Brandon, can you eat like a normal person for once in your life?" she asked him. He didn't reply. He continued to ignore her. It was then that Mom lost her patience. "You look like a savage. Aren't you ashamed? Is it so difficult to eat a plate of pasta without humiliating us all?" She complained nonstop, and I clearly remember the last thing she said. "Sometimes I think you really have no future. You're destined to be a loser if you don't change." Then Brandon dropped his fork onto his plate, and the metallic sound echoed like a bad omen. He got up slowly with a completely red face, and before anyone could react, he grabbed the biggest knife on the table, raised it with both hands, and lunged at Mom. Everything happened so fast that I couldn't process what I was seeing. The first blow hit her on the shoulder, but Brandon didn't stop. He fell on top of her, shouting things I couldn't understand while stabbing her repeatedly. There was blood everywhere. It was the most horrible thing I had ever witnessed. Screams filled the house. My aunt fainted, the children started crying, and nobody knew what to do. It was total chaos. I jumped out of my chair and ran towards them, shouting, "Brandon, stop, you're going to kill her." But he was absolutely out of control, moving like a madman. That wasn't the sensitive brother I knew. It was as if something else was driving him. Mom stopped moving, collapsing under Brandon's brutal onslaught, but he kept attacking her as if he couldn't stop. Blood was spurting everywhere, and when I managed to get close enough, Brandon turned to me. His face was stained with blood, and his eyes were simply empty, as if my brother had never existed in that body. "This is your fault. You always take his side," he shouted, lunging at me with the knife raised. I had no time to think. I just raised my arms to protect myself and felt the edge cut into my skin. The pain was extreme, but the fear was even worse. I knew that if I didn't do something, I wouldn't get out of this alive. We fell to the ground struggling, and I realized that I had more strength than I could have ever imagined. I grabbed his wrist with all my might, but I felt like I was losing. At that moment, my uncle finally realized what was happening and ran towards us, grabbing Brandon from behind, trying to pull him away from me. Other family members joined in, but Brandon fought like a wild animal. He bit, kicked, and punched anyone who came near him. It looked like he would never tire, and just when I thought it was over, Brandon broke free and lunged at me again. I fell to the floor, but my other uncle managed to stop him halfway. When the police arrived, Brandon was struggling on the floor, immobilized, but still shouting that Mom deserved to die, that she was the problem and not him. The scene was chaotic. The room was an absolute mess. Mom was dead and her body was torn apart, covered in blood. I could barely stand up, my arm cut off and my legs trembling like jelly. During the interrogation, the police told me that Brandon was completely calm, looking at the floor with a blank expression. "She deserved it," he said, as if what had happened didn't bother him at all. He said that maybe he had been wrong about his brother, that is to say about me, but that Mom definitely deserved it. In the end, they declared him not guilty by reason of insanity and sent him to a psychiatric hospital. The doctor said he suffered from severe psychosis, but that didn't make the situation any more understandable. I still saw him as my brother, the boy who used to cry when someone teased him. But that part of him was gone. Now the house is empty. I moved in with my aunt and uncle, and there isn't a single family holiday where I don't feel everyone's pitying glances. The truth is, I feel pathetic talking about Brandon. I'd rather no one mentioned him. I've tried to visit him, I really have, but every time I see him I realize that in reality, Brandon also died that day, shortly before Mom.